Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this first day of Black History Month for the start of MLK Week 2021, Chaos or Community, and tonight's kickoff event, Courageous Conversations in AI. My name is Rose Ampuero. I use she, her, herself pronouns, and I am currently serving as the Interim Associate Dean of Student Affairs and one of 4 Chief Inclusivity Officers at Tandon. Please note that live captioning is available for today's program. You can turn it on by clicking the button found at the bottom of your screen labeled Closed Captions. This week marks the 16th annual MLK at New York University, a week dedicated to honoring Dr. King's legacy and commemorating his speech delivered at NYU in 1961. And for the 7th year, NYU Tandon is hosting an event to start off the week. Though we cannot be together in person, we do hope you will enjoy the event today, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you in person by this time next year. As I look back at the school I joined several years ago, it's hard to believe where we are today and where we used to be. For the past year and a half, our school has developed and begun to put into action a strategic plan making diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging the forefront of everything we do. Faculty, staff, students, and even alumni have come together to begin the work of creating a culture that embraces differences, challenges the status quo, and lays the foundation for systemic change. Part of that requires looking at the different areas within the STEM industry and having the courage and commitment to speak up. To that end, during tonight's program, you will learn how artificial intelligence mimics social injustices, but also how we begin to have the difficult and uncomfortable conversations that will propel our students and future leaders to build a sustainable community from the chaos. Kindly note all questions should be asked via the Q&A window indicating whom the question is for, and all questions will be discussed towards the end of the program. Attendees are encouraged to utilize the chat feature to share any preliminary thoughts, reactions, etc. And without further ado, let's begin with our first presenter, Dr. Julia Stojanovic, co-director of the NYU Center for Responsible AI.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Rose. It's an absolute pleasure to be taking part in this event. And today, I have the pleasure to be discussing with you a topic that I'm very enthusiastic about. It's a topic where my mind and my heart meet, and that is how do we use technology, in particular AI, artificial intelligence, responsibly in the world in which we live today. I am Julia Stojanovic. I hold a joint appointment at the Computer Science and Engineering Department at the Tandon School of Engineering and at the Center for Data Science. So let us start by agreeing on one important thing, and that is AI is great. The convergence of unprecedented data collection capabilities, enormous computational power, and broad acceptance of data collection and analysis as a way to move society forward is offering us tremendous opportunities to do good. We can accelerate scientific discovery in areas ranging from astrophysics to medicine. We can boost innovation in a myriad of ways, from self-driving cars to advertisement targeting and back. We can improve society by improving how governments function, by helping make resource distribution more equitable, and by bringing greater transparency and accountability to government operations. And perhaps most importantly, we can get AI to do all of our work so that we can just sit back and relax at the beach. But before we rejoice at the possibilities, let's step back and unpack that term, artificial intelligence or AI. What is AI anyway? Consider the task that many of us attempted with mixed results during the COVID-19 lockdown, baking sourdough bread. I will use this task as my running example to discuss algorithms, data, and decisions. Here's an algorithm. First, we prep. We buy ingredients, measure them. Next, we mix. We combine yeast, flour, and water, cover, and wait for the dough to rise. After this, we knead. Shape the dough, wait some more, repeat. And finally, we bake. This recipe is the algorithm. It lists the steps that we take to transform the ingredients into a loaf of bread. The algorithm may be fully prescribed. It may list exactly what ingredients to get, exactly how much to take of each ingredient, in what order to combine them, how long to wait, and at what temperature to bake. We call such algorithms rule-based. If we know the rules well enough to write them down, and if we can always get exactly the same ingredients, then every time we will bake a great loaf of bread. But we may or may not always be so lucky. We may not know the rules for making a good loaf of sourdough to begin with, and we may also want to see some variety in the outcomes. Alternatively, our algorithm may be adaptive. It could learn to bake. Now, how does that work? Well, we may keep the structure of this recipe the same, but try different combinations of ingredients, mixing and kneading techniques, waiting times, and baking temperature and time. And then we may ask a person, do you like how the sourdough came out? If so, we may keep these settings, or maybe we'll try something slightly different, or a lot different, and see which result we like better. From this, we can figure out what ingredients and what combinations of parameters work well together. We discussed the algorithms. Now, what about the data? Data comes in multiple forms. One form is the combination of ingredients that we take as input. Another form of data is the parameters of the recipe. And then there is the data that describes the output, the loaf that we baked. How much does it weigh? What is its nutritional value? Can we quantify the degree to which it's chewy on the inside and crusty on the outside? These are all objectively measurable factors. The final kind of data is human judgment. Did the loaf come out well enough or not? Is it tasty? Does it look good? This data is the subjective feedback that we get on the output. And more often than not, it's more important than some objective properties of the output. We talked about algorithms and data. Now, what about decisions? In the process I described, a human is making a decision every time that they execute this algorithm. Does the loaf look good enough to taste? Is it tasty? Are we giving it a thumbs up or a thumbs down? A decision that is more consequential is, now that we've tried a bunch of recipes, which will we consider a success? Will we decide to always or never use some specific ingredients or some specific parameters? Will we say that it's more important to have an appetizing looking loaf or one that consistently comes out as chewy on the inside and crusty on the outside? Next up on the scale of more consequential yet is, do we think that we've tried out enough recipes to pass our experience on to a machine and to trust that machine to bake on our behalf? Will we trust the machine to bake something different, like baguettes? What about picking different ingredients? What about making judgments on our behalf, deciding what baked goods came out well and which ones did not? How much autonomy do we give to a machine, to a learning algorithm, to an AI? If you'd like to learn more about algorithms, computation, data, and the impacts on society, I highly recommend the recent book, The Age of the Algorithms by Serge Abitboul and Gilles Dovec. I would like to quote from this book. Algorithms are probably the most sophisticated tools that people have had at their disposal since the beginnings of human history. They have transformed science, industry, and society. They upset the concepts of work, property, government, private life, even humanity. Going easily from one extreme to the other, we rejoice that they make life easier for us, but fear that they will enslave us. Creations of the human spirit, algorithms are what we made them, and they will be what we want them to be. It's up to us to choose the world we want to live in. This final message is what I would like for all of us to take away from today's conversation, is that we humans have control over the technology that we build and over how we deploy it in society. Now, some of these algorithms have been called AI, returning to the topic of our conversation. More precisely, I would characterize an AI as a system in which algorithms use data and make decisions on our behalf, or help us make decisions. An example of AI, and this is an early example, is Roomba, a robot that helps us clean. Roomba is great at autonomously vacuuming the floor and is one of the first victories of classical rule-based AI. It's the stuff of textbooks. The decisions a Roomba makes are what's a good strategy to clean an entire room that it may not have seen before? How should it go about mapping out the room? And what next move should it make? Go left, go right, or turn around? Another example of highly successful AI is IBM's Deep Blue that beat Garry Kasparov, the legendary grandmaster at chess in 1997. Several algorithms followed, including AlphaZero, that taught itself chess. This success at chess and at learning a game starting from basic rules is one of the holy grails of AI. The decisions in chess are more complex than in Roomba, but they are similar in that they are strategic. What's a good overall strategy to take? What's a meaningful next move? And how should the algorithm adjust its strategy in response to the decisions of its opponent? But now enter another use of AI, and that is going to be the topic of the remainder of my discussion today. That is the use of AI in hiring. The decisions that we are asking an AI to make here are very different from those made by Roomba and by Deep Blue. We are asking it to predict who will do well on the job and who will not do well. The big question is, can an AI succeed at this task that amounts to predicting social outcomes? How do we know whether it has succeeded? How do we measure success? And do we want an AI to be making such predictions in the first place? Do we consider this to be ethical? Now let us look more closely at automated hiring systems. In a recent report from Upturn, the hiring process is described as a series of decisions that form a funnel, a socio-legal technical system that is operationalized as a sequence of data-driven, algorithm-assisted steps in which a series of decisions culminates in job offers to some and rejections to others. The process starts when employers source candidates with the help of ads or job postings. Next, during the screening stage, employers assess candidates by analyzing their experience, skills, and characteristics. Through interviewing applicants, employers continue their assessment in a more direct fashion. During the selection step, employers make final hiring and compensation determinations. Importantly, data and predictive analytics that I have been casually denoting as AI are used during all of these stages. As stated by Jenny Yang, former commissioner of the US Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, automated hiring systems act as modern gatekeepers to economic opportunity. And now some bad news. One of the earliest indications that there is cause for concern came in 2015 with the results of the Ad-Fisher study out of Carnegie Mellon University. The authors ran an experiment and found that ads for high-paying jobs were shown far more frequently to men than to women. This brings back memories of the time when it was legal to advertise jobs by gender in newspapers. This practice was outlawed in the United States in 1964, but it persists in the online ad environment today. Let us advance to the next stage of the hiring pipeline, resume screening. In late 2018, it was reported that Amazon's AI recruiting tool that was developed with the stated goal of increasing workforce diversity, in fact, did the opposite thing. The system taught itself that male candidates were preferable to female candidates. it penalized resumes that included the word women's, as in women's chess club captain, and downgraded graduates of 2 all-women's colleges. Other examples of discrimination include shutting out people suffering from mental illness, such as depression or bipolar disorder, on the basis of online personality tests, even if they have the right skills for the job. Another example, later yet in the hiring funnel, perhaps during a post-interview background check by a potential employer, was surfaced by LaTanya Sweeney, a computer science professor on the faculty at Harvard, who showed that Googling for African-American sounding names, such as her own, LaTanya, is more likely to trigger ads suggestive of a criminal record than with white-sounding names. And this happens even if you control for whether an individual in question, in fact, has a criminal record. To summarize, despite their potential to improve efficiency for both employers and job applicants, automated hiring tools are also raising concerns. These pertain to the unfairness in the decisions made by these systems, and we usually denote this by discrimination, and to the unfairness in the process by which these decisions are made. And these we sometimes call due process violations or concerns. Very often, discrimination and due process violations are linked to the term bias, a term that we will revisit in a couple of minutes. There are also concerns about whether these tools actually work, whether they are picking up useful signal from the data or are an elaborate coin flip at best. As Arvind Narayanan, a computer scientist at Princeton, puts it, are these tools AI snake oil? In the complex ecosystem in which automated hiring tools are commissioned, developed, and used, we must ask ourselves, who is responsible for ensuring that these tools are built and used appropriately? Who is responsible for catching and mitigating discrimination and due process violations, and for controlling the proliferation of snake oil under the fancy label of data science and AI? And what my culpability lineup depicts is that I think that we all are responsible as professionals and as individuals. In response to this question about responsibility, we've been seeing attempts to regulate the use of data-driven algorithmic tools, such as those that make part of the hiring funnel. The hiring funnel, as well as each component of the funnel, are examples of so-called automated decision systems, or ADS. These systems process data about people, some of which may be sensitive or proprietary. They help make decisions that are consequential to people's lives and livelihoods. They involve a combination of human and automated decision-making. They are designed with the stated goals of improving efficiency and promoting, or at least not hindering, equitable access to opportunity, and they are subject to auditing for legal compliance and at least potentially to public disclosure. ADS may or may not use AI, although most of them are built as AI because then you can sell them for more money. And they may or may not have autonomy, but they all rely heavily on data. How might we go about regulating ADS? And should we even attempt to? This is the subject of intense debate, some of which I had the chance to witness firsthand here in New York City. While the predominant sentiment in the industry is still that regulation will stifle innovation, industry alone, thankfully, doesn't get to decide. And even in the Silicon Valley, the need for meaningful regulation to ease compliance and limit liability is starting to be more and more broadly recognized. There is much debate on a specific regulatory framework. Should we use precautionary principles that can be summarized as better safe than sorry, or more likely attempt a more agile, risk-based method, such as algorithmic impact assessment? All this and more is subject of intense debate. New York City recently made a very public commitment to opening the black box of the government's use of technology. In May 2018, an automated decision systems task force was convened, the first such in the United States, and charged with providing recommendations to the city's agencies about becoming transparent and accountable in their use of ADS. I had an opportunity to be a member of that task force. The task force issued its report in November 19, making a commitment to using ADS where they are beneficial, not just because they exist, promoting fairness, equity, accountability, and transparency in their use, and reducing potential harm across the lifespan. This first point here relates and reinforces the no to AI snake oil sentiment that I already discussed. And while making important points in the report, the ADS task force didn't go very far in terms of concrete recommendations. But we may have an immediate opportunity to make things a lot more concrete with all of your help. And so I would like to bring to your attention the proposal for a law that would regulate the use of automated employment decision tools in New York City. If passed, this law will apply to the use of these tools both in government and in industry. It will prohibit the sale of such tools if they were not the subject of an audit for bias. The law will also require to disclose to candidates, job applicants, when such tools were used to assess them, and also to disclose what job qualifications or characteristics were used in the screening. So let's discuss very quickly the first aspect of this proposed bill, and that is auditing for bias. Bias is a term that is used very often these days to explain what's wrong with automated decisions, but it remains poorly understood. So what do we mean by bias? Our meaning of this term is not in the traditional sense that is used by statisticians who say that a model is biased if it does not summarize the data correctly. Instead, what we are seeing examples of is societal bias exhibiting itself in the data. Let's unpack this further. Data is an image of the world. It's mirror reflection. When we think about societal bias in the data, we interrogate this reflection. One interpretation of bias in the data is that the reflection is distorted. We may systematically overrepresent or underrepresent particular parts of the world in the data, or otherwise distort the readings. It is important to keep in mind that a reflection cannot know whether it's distorted. That is, data alone cannot tell us whether it's a distorted reflection of a perfect world, a perfect reflection of a distorted world, or if these distortions compound. Another interpretation of bias in the data is that even if we were able to take a reflection of the world perfectly in the data, it would still be a reflection of the world such as it is today, and not necessarily of how it could or should be. And once again, importantly, it's not up to data or an algorithm, but rather up to people, individuals, groups, and society at large to come to consensus about whether the world is how it should be, or if it needs to be improved. And if so, how we should go about improving it. My final point here is that changing the reflection does not necessarily change the world. If the reflection itself is used to make important decisions, for example, whom to hire or what salary to offer to an individual being hired, then compensating for the distortions is worthwhile. But the mirror metaphor only takes us so far. We have to work much harder, usually going far beyond technological solutions, to propagate the changes back into the world, not merely brush up the reflection. We touched on the bias dimension of the proposed law. What about public disclosure? This requirement of public disclosure in the proposed New York City algorithmic hiring bill leads us to the topic of interpretability that I will cover in just 1 minute. My students, colleagues, and I are developing interpretability tools based on the concept of a nutritional label. I think that this concept would apply very well here and would love to hear your thoughts. With this idea, we draw an analogy to the food industry where simple, standard labels convey information about the ingredients and production processes. Short of setting up a chemistry lab, the consumer would otherwise have no access to this information. Similarly, individuals being considered for jobs have no way to tell what features are being used to evaluate them unless these are disclosed. The label should be comprehensible, short, simple, and clear. It should be consultative, providing actionable information. Based on this information, job applicants may, for example, take a certification exam to improve their chances of being hired. Further, labels should enable comparisons between processes at different companies, implying a standard. It is now time to wrap up, and I would like to leave you with a few parting thoughts. In my presentation today, I nudged us to think about automated hiring systems, possible regulatory mechanisms, bias, and public disclosure. Most importantly, as we think through these issues together, I'd love for us to find a pragmatic middle ground between the harmful extremes of techno-optimism, a belief that technology can single-handedly fix deep-seated societal problems like structural discrimination in hiring, and techno-bashing. And there is a belief that any attempt to operationalize ethics and legal compliance in systems such as those used in hiring will amount to fair washing, and so should be dismissed outright. An important thread that runs through our discussion is that we cannot fully automate responsibility. While some of the duties of carrying out the task of, say, legal compliance can in principle be assigned to an algorithm, the accountability for the decisions being made by an algorithmic system always rests with the person. This person may be a decision maker or a regulator, a business leader or a software developer, or importantly, perhaps most importantly, a member of the public. For this reason, I see the role of technologists, such as myself, in helping build systems that expose the knobs of responsibility to people. Of course, the systems we're helping build are not simply technical. They are socio-legal technical. In some sense, technology is the easy part here. This means that to expose the knobs of responsibility to people, we must work together to create meaningful regulatory mechanisms. And also, I see my role and responsibility as a technologist and an educator in helping create a new generation of AI practitioners and an informed public. These three synergistic goals, responsible development of technology, education, and public engagement on responsible AI, and work on regulation standards and auditing, form part of the vision of the newly established Center for Responsible AI at NYU. I'm wrapping up just to give you a couple of examples of some ongoing educational activities are a novel course on responsible data science offered to graduate and undergraduate students at NYU. This highly technical course is attracting an engaged and diverse cohort of students. Another example is a series of workshops we've been running in collaboration with the Queen's Public Library on uncovering hidden decisions, AI in hiring. And early this year, we are planning to release a public-facing course through the libraries, starting with the Queen's Public Library, called AI for the People. Finally, I would like to highlight that we recently released the first volume of a comic series on responsible AI called Mirror Mirror. I created this volume over the summer with the very talented Fala Arif Khan. And we just recently released also a Spanish and a French version of this comic, and volume 2 is also coming out in just a couple of weeks. Thank you very much. This is a very quick spotlight for a program that the Center for Data Science is running to engage individuals from historically underrepresented groups in research. And with that, I conclude. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Julia, for that very, very insightful presentation and for sharing those resources and initiatives here at NYU that our community can take advantage of. Good evening, everyone. My name is Alethea Orby. I am also a staff member here at Student Affairs for NYU Tandon. I'm really excited to introduce our next guest. I'd really like to echo, what Julia was saying about how we are all responsible and we need to hold each other accountable. And that really is the theme tonight and this week. And so our next guest this evening, Jennifer Wen, she'll really be helping us navigate these sorts of questions. How do we communicate with one another more effectively overall? How can we think about the ethics and culture of AI when it seems we still haven't gotten the human aspect down still? And how do we have crucial conversations on these sorts of topics, whether it's with our friends, family, colleagues, our superiors, and make sure that they're productive and, more importantly, move towards a better understanding of each other and even towards healing. So I'm happy to introduce Jennifer Wen, who is a professor at NYU Stern. She teaches difficult conversations and is also the founder of Wen Strategies, a consultancy focused on organizational transformation, change leadership, and healing. Previously, Jen was the director of education at the Obama Foundation, a manager at McKinsey & Company, and a founding teacher and school leader of a middle school. She has a BA from Harvard College, an MBA from NYU Stern, and a master's in education from Hunter College. I personally had the pleasure of hearing Jennifer speak at a graduate class that I was in last semester, and I couldn't help but feel, so struck about the knowledge and tools that she shared with us about engaging in difficult conversations. And I'm just really excited, to show that to all of you tonight. And so thank you, Jen, for being with us this evening. Really looking forward. How are you?
I'm great after that introduction. Thank you, Alethea.
Of course, have to.
And if at any point you can't hear me clearly, just holler, and I'm happy to repeat or re-engage.
Absolutely. So we'll be mindful of time. We'll just get things started. Just starting, baseline. What does, productive conversation or dialogue look like? What skills does a person really need to have a successful conversation?
I can definitely answer that. I almost want to talk about what a difficult conversation is first.
Absolutely.
Since productive dialogue is our way out of those very stuck moments when we are having a difficult conversation. Can we do that?
Absolutely. Go ahead. I'd love to hear.
Great. When I spoke at a class that Alethea was in, she threw some tough questions my way and gave me a chance to practice difficult conversation skills on the spot. So I feel it's only fair if I throw a question back at you, Alethea.
Oh, no.
Here I go. To get us in this mind frame of what it's like to be in a difficult conversation, could you share with us some topics that maybe in the past have been difficult for you to discuss?
Absolutely. I will definitely say, last year was a very challenging year. And senses were very heightened. I remember having a friend, once information was going around about vaccination processes, there was a lot of disdain and skepticism around that. And so I was noticing that this person was promoting a lot of misinformation about the vaccinations. And I remember feeling very uncomfortable about it, because it's like, how do I talk to my friend about, the information they're posting, knowing that, they're coming from a valid place, but without hurting our friendship. And so I actually thought of the lessons that you taught us, which I'm sure you'll talk more about, but not even just, talking with our friends about topics that may be polarizing or we have different values or beliefs. I've also had experiences, in the workplace when we're talking about, DEI initiatives. And it's like, how do I, as a Black woman, engage in these conversations that don't portray me in some light in their eyes that detracts from the conversation as a whole. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that.
Thank you for sharing. And there will be some people who can relate to that and some who cannot. So someone might say, misinformation about a vaccine, not difficult for me. I just let them stick to their opinion and I keep it moving. And it can be incredibly difficult. Or someone might say, oh yeah, issues of my identity. Yeah, that's really difficult for me. Someone might say, negotiating client fees. I teach at Stern at the School of Business. So, we talk about a lot of business topics like that. Someone might say, oh, negotiating client fees, so hard. And someone else might say, I love a good negotiation. And so what you quickly come to see is that it's less about the topic and more about the inner experience that each individual is having.
Mhm.
And authors of a book called Crucial Conversations, which is one of the texts we use in my Difficult Conversations course, there are 4 different authors to it, so I won't name them all, but the authors say what makes a crucial conversation, as they put it, or a difficult conversation, are 3 factors: opposing opinions,
Mhm.
stakes are really high, and you're feeling strong emotions.
Oh yeah.
When those 3 things are present, opposing opinions, stakes are high, strong emotions, you've got a difficult conversation. And what creates that for one person, I'll add, is not what creates it for another.
This is true.
And so when we find ourselves stuck in these difficult conversations where we're trying to decide, like you, Alethea, do I address the topic at hand
Right.
so that we can get to a better outcome on the topic or the work, and potentially risk the relationship with a friend, a colleague, whomever it might be that I care about? Or do I just leave the topic alone and not touch it at all so that I can preserve the relationship?
Mhm.
What we come to see in the Difficult Conversations course and in other readings is that's a fool's choice. I shouldn't have to decide between improving the work or saving my relationship. There's got to be a middle way, a better way, where we can improve the work and strengthen our relationship. Better outcomes for the topic at hand and the people at hand. And that's what productive dialogue enables. So to get back to your original question, Alethea, productive dialogue is the free flow of meaning and information between 2 or more people. And the goal of effective dialogue is to learn to maximize our shared pool of meaning so that all parties, all members of this conversation better understand what's going on here for you and for me, because our inner experiences are different. And so the skills are learnable and teachable. Productive dialogue is about listening and speaking. And as you might imagine, it's more about listening than it is about speaking. That's how we're going to maximize the shared understanding between us. I know what I think. I need to gain access to the information that you have, what you're thinking and feeling, which is invisible to me. That data is not yet available to me until I inquire. So I could speak to some of those listening and speaking skills if it would be helpful. You tell me, Alethea.
I definitely think the skills are necessary, but I am really curious to know just, you mentioned before about getting stuck. And I imagine, we may start the conversation with good intentions about here's what we're only going to do. We're going to speak and we're going to listen. But I imagine at some point, emotions will get high again. And then we kind of lose focus. And then the conversation just ends or the dialogue just ends. So how do we come back and how do we check ourselves in the moment?
Great question. Centering ourselves in the present by focusing on the facts, by asking ourselves a question like, what can I possibly learn here that I may not already know? Imagining myself with my best friend, that can really calm me or center me. There are various techniques we can use that take us out of the emotional charge of the moment and center us to be our most choiceful selves. And I want to share a bit about the neuroscience behind it, quite frankly, because whether we like it or not, we're hardwired this way. When we sense a threat, and I don't just mean a threat to our physical well-being, we are social creatures, so it can be a threat to how I am perceived socially, which was something you mentioned, Alethea. It could be a threat to a value that I hold deeply. There are a variety of ways that we can feel threatened. When we feel threatened, there are habitual neural responses that happen in our brain that we cannot control. It's a stress response to some fear that is being triggered in us. And what that stress response does is it bypasses the neocortex. That's the frontal lobe. And that part handles executive functioning. It lets us step back and ask a question and consider whether something is in fact the way I perceive it to be, or might it be different? Well, when we feel a fear, when we've been threatened in some way, the neural response is to bypass that neocortex and go straight to the amygdala, which are two glands back here. It's a primordial brain. You're head nodding to this. And that primordial brain says, we don't have time to stop and ask a question. I got to react. I'm being threatened here. I got to defend you.
I know
That's
that's
a
right.
survival instinct. Alethea is head nodding. She's definitely been in this moment. And in that moment, it's fight, flight, or freeze. Those are the three options. And quite frankly, fighting, fleeing, or freezing in front of my colleague is not helpful.
Very true.
And so we do need to find ways to manage that amygdala hijack, as it's often referred to, because we cannot get rid of it. And so as much as we can increase our self-awareness of when we are being triggered, when that amygdala is taking over, the better. And there are many cues. There are physical cues, a lump in your throat, sweaty palms, a pit in your stomach. Oh no, I don't want to trigger you. There are psychological or emotional cues. You might feel anxious. You might feel shocked, taken aback, offended, confused, etc. Once we become aware of the in the moment cues that let us know we're being triggered, while we cannot stop that amygdala hijack from taking place, we can pause and give ourselves time to re-engage that neofrontal cortex.
I see. That's really interesting. I love the neuroscience piece to it. So that being said, then what would you say are the crucial skills that a person needs to have a successful conversation?
So listening skills and speaking skills. On the listening side, I'll name two, which are just core interpersonal communication skills: inquiry and paraphrasing. On the speaking side, I'll call it advocacy, but I'll say more about what I mean. And you'll notice very intentionally that I'm naming more listening skills than speaking skills. So on the listening side, inquiry is about asking questions to learn, and only to learn, not to poke holes in someone's argument, not to disguise a statement as a question. Are you really going to leave that refrigerator door open like that? That's not a question, or at least not the way I mean inquiry, but instead open-ended questions. Can you give me some examples of what you meant? Right?
Sure.
Oh,
I'm sorry. I took that literally. Sorry, go ahead.
Up here. And then on the paraphrasing side, which is the other listening skill I mentioned, this is about expressing your understanding of the central parts of what someone said and checking for understanding. So it's saying, I think I'm hearing you say, and then you don't repeat exactly back to them what they've just said to you. Instead, you summarize what you understand it to be. And that lets that person know, A, that you're really listening, and B, that you are open to them correcting you if you have misunderstood them. And that's where that goal to truly learn and maximize the shared pool of meaning comes to life. And then to finish maximizing that shared pool of meaning, because it's not just about me better understanding the other person's perspective, it's also about them better understanding my perspective, I want to bring in that advocacy piece. And by that, I just simply mean you're speaking for yourself with power and clarity. So this is not a joke or an offhand comment where you leave the person guessing and they're not quite sure what you meant and if you were being serious. No, it's stating with clarity what you observed and how that impacted you. And the observation piece is something we can all align around. I noticed you arrived at 6:05 instead of 6 p.m. It's a fact. One of our 5 senses was used to observe it. But the impact it had on me might be really different than what the other person might assume or know. And that When I share that impact on me is where I start to really expand that shared pool of meaning. So inquiry, paraphrasing, and advocacy. Those are 3 dialogue skills or interpersonal communication skills that can maximize the productivity of our dialogue, both for the work at hand and the relationship.
I really like how you broke that down. I know I'm definitely guilty of, focusing more on the advocacy part than say, the inquiry. I'm thinking, how can I say everything I need to say so they hear me and not focus enough on what they have to say. And so I can imagine, when we're talking about community and coalition building, when we're engaging with people who may think differently or feel differently or even think the same but may approach things differently, it's like, how can we make sure that we are open to hear these different opinions? It's more than just the extreme of, oh, they have completely different political beliefs and they're completely wrong. But how do we engage with those who on the surface level have similar beliefs but may see things differently? Do you know what I'm saying?
I think I do, but I'm going to paraphrase, and I'm
Sure.
inviting check for understanding. I'm inviting you to correct me.
Mhm.
I think you're asking, how do we discuss difficult conversations,
Mhm.
even with people that we are building coalition with or building community with,
Right.
and therefore might be all the more concerned that we would hurt the relationship.
Right. That's
Is-
exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. You're
Okay.
right.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I'm going to remind us of the crucial conversations definition of a difficult conversation.
Mhm.
Stakes are high,
Mhm.
emotions are strong, opposing opinions, or we might say opinions vary.
Mm.
So even when we're in community with one another, and perhaps even more so when we're in community to build coalition together, the stakes can feel very high because we've come together to solve a problem or seize an opportunity that we don't want to miss.
Mhm.
Emotions can definitely be strong because it's about something we care about. And opinions can definitely vary on how we get there. So, given that, we've got to recognize we will come across difficult conversations even when we are in community with one another. So,
Absolutely.
how can I be aware of when I am being triggered?
Mm.
When that inner experience, that amygdala hijack is happening in the moment? Doesn't do me as good if I realize it afterwards, though I
Right.
can still do something about it then. How can I be aware of what my cues are for myself, physical cues, emotional cues, whatever it may be, so that when that happens, I can pause and recenter myself?
Mhm.
And sometimes, depending on the trigger, all I need for a pause is a moment to put down my head. Let's say I pretend I'm taking notes and just take a deep breath. And that's enough to center me.
Yeah.
Other times, the trigger is so strong and the emotional reactivity I'm having has such an intense charge to it that in order to recenter, I truly need to step away.
Mhm.
And I need to ask myself, what is at stake here for me?
Right.
What filter or lens am I viewing this situation through that is coloring my ability to see it for what it is, which is just a chance for me and my colleague or my fellow community member to better understand how each of us is approaching it, what matters most to each of us, and together co-create a path forward from our shared pool of understanding.
Mhm.
And so sometimes we have to say, excuse me, I realize that I'm reacting in the moment and I don't want to do that. I want to be more thoughtful about it.
Mhm.
Could we come back to this conversation in an hour tomorrow? I just want to take some time to reflect. I care too much about our relationship. I care too much about our work. I know how much success matters to us. I want to come back at this from the right frame of mind.
I definitely like using that tool. I'm not afraid to say, I need to take a breath because I know whatever I may say next may not be a true representation of how I feel. Coming back to the question I just asked, how do we flip it over? So when we encounter someone, whether a community member or not, that doesn't possess these skills that we may have, cultivated ourselves, how do we then carry on that conversation? A person who doesn't want to listen, who doesn't want to hear your advocacy or doesn't care about the questions, they're just, this is my point, this is all I'm going to say, and that's it. What do we do about that?
Such a great, tough question. um, Trying to find a shared goal is a really helpful technique for getting both people talking as opposed to, fighting, freezing or fleeing. So for example, a shared goal might be, I would just love to understand your perspective more. And I'm hoping we can get to a place where you could understand mine too. Would you be down for engaging in a conversation just to increase our understanding? Or another thing might be, I know how much success matters to both of us on this topic. And I think the way we're coming at it right now, we're not hearing each other. Could we step away and come back when we're both ready to hear each other out? Because I know together we can be successful on this. And so on and so forth. Finding a shared goal or a shared set of values that can make each person willing to step away from the way they are currently viewing the situation and instead view it from a lens that increases that shared pool of meaning. That's the way to go.
Okay, I really like that shared goal. And I'd like to bring this back to, Julia's presentation. And when we're talking about, AI and even hiring, there is a lot of anxiety about having these sorts of conversations, especially with our superiors, especially within systems that have been in place for so long. It's like, how do we find that courage to speak up and to say something, to say, hey, this is not accurate, or I don't like how this is working, or you're completely alienating a whole group, or you're not seeing a whole group. And so in the work environment, I imagine the approach is a little different. The same, different? What would you say?
In terms of finding the courage to have these conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, the refining of the algorithm, the deciding of what data to supply the algorithm with, and so on and so forth, the various choice points that Julia presented to us are going to create varying opinions.
Mm-hmm.
So there will always be an opportunity, yes, for us to have a difficult conversation, but another way to think about it is to grow our shared pool of meaning and understanding between one another. And so when we are having these conversations in the workplace, it's the same set of skills. And if I had to boil it down to two things, I would encourage folks to remember. One, self-awareness. Can I be aware in the moment that I am triggered so that I can move from a place of reactivity and just reacting because the amygdala led me to do so, to a place of choicefulness, pausing, choosing what route I'm going to go next, and coming from a place of curiosity. So self-awareness, and then dialogue, and remembering that the purpose of dialogue is to get a free flow of information, an exchange of meaning between us.
Thank you.
From there, we can co-create a lot of solutions,
Mm-hmm.
and not only co-create solutions in general, but co-create solutions that get to the heart of the matter.
Right. Thank you for saying that. And so right now we will move to our Q&A. So I would like to invite Julia to turn her camera back on for this next portion. Thank you, Julia. And so it looks like we have a couple questions here. We'll start with the first. I'm sure you can see it for both of you. This one's for Jen. How do power dynamics and play into crucial conversations and impact the strategies one might use? Thinking of, professor-student dynamics or supervisor and their employee dynamics.
Great question. So every conversation is an opportunity to shift power or share power. So with that said, what is power? Power is the ability to influence the outcome of something. And knowledge, information, is one of the tools by which we influence the outcome. So when I enter a conversation with someone who has a different rank in the hierarchy from me, or a different position of privilege than I have, I'm probably hyper aware of that power that they have over me, whether they are cognizant of it or not. but I can also be aware of the power that I have with the information that is available to me. And growing that shared pool of meaning and information between us is a way of, if not shifting, sharing power. So that's one thought that comes to mind when I hear that question. Another thought is the extent to which we can both be aware of the power dynamics, then we can do something about it. And so naming, I'd just like to share that something I'm aware of is the difference present here, right? It could be a difference in hierarchy, it could be a different, whatever it may be. And I just want to name that for me, it is making me a bit nervous. I don't want to harm the relationship here, or whatever the feeling may be. And I say that for two reasons. You'll obviously have to decide whether this is a safe space to say that or not. But the reason I bring that up, one, self-disclosure is a way of increasing trust between people, and through trust comes change. Two, if that person was not aware of that power dynamic, and often when we sit in a place of privilege, we are not aware of it, now having that awareness might enable them to take a different set of actions and turn that power dynamic on its head, or at least share that power differently. So obviously in the context of safety first, you got to take care of yourself, but consider what growing the shared pool of awareness between you all around the very power dynamic that you're concerned about could do, and also consider the role of the information you have in shifting power.
Thank you, Jen. I think that was a great answer. Julia, I think I'd love to hear your answer to this next question. Someone's asking to rank from a scale of 1 to 10, below expectations or exceeds expectations on the 10, how far we as a society are meeting the challenges that you've outlined in your presentation. And if the number is less than 10, what are the most crucial actions that we must take as a society and as individuals?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. And, you know, as I was listening to Jen, I couldn't help but notice that, of course, there's a parallel between how we think about the role of AI systems in society in terms of the power dynamics, in terms of our inability to understand what is in their proverbial heads and how they're acting on our behalf. And the kind of a conversation that we have about power dynamics in conversation between two individuals, right? And being able to deal with a situation of conflict. So I think that absolutely the concern that I raised, and that is the main concern, is that we as members of a society have not allowed ourselves to exercise agency in our interaction with these algorithmic systems. We have not allowed ourselves to feel that we are the ones that should be in control of this conversation, that we are the ones who should really be determining how we design these systems. Do we design them? How do we deploy them? And how do we oversee their use? And you know, similarly, again, to the topics that Jen was raising, I think that the main way for us to start making a difference is to understand that we are responsible for educating ourselves sufficiently and for trusting ourselves to actually enter and actively engage in this conversation. So in my mind, really, it will make or break AI and our ability to use AI productively, whether we are able to step up as people and take control of the situation. So that's kind of the highest level answer that I can give.
Thank you. Jen, do you have anything? 1 to 10?
I don't, but I am really struck by what Julia shared and the self-awareness around whether we are exercising our agency fully or not. Wow, building our self-awareness muscle around that seems like it would help in so many pieces of maximizing AI.
Absolutely. Julia, I do have another question for you. Someone has asked, does ADS guarantee that there is no bias in recommendations for jobs, as it is mostly dependent on the human-centered? And how can we overcome that?
Okay, so I'm not entirely sure that I understand the question, but absolutely, when we use algorithmic and data-driven tools to help us make decisions, we absolutely cannot be guaranteed that these decisions are not biased in using any definition of the term bias. And this is because the way that we program these systems is based usually on historical data, right? And historical data reflects the world such as it has been. It's a world in which discrimination has been exercised for decades and centuries and millennia, arguably, right? So if you're going to automate, essentially, taking a data set, picking up some patterns from that data set and saying that this is now going to be a decision that I take into the future, and this essentially is what these hiring ADS do and ADS in other contexts, if they're left unchecked, then what we will be doing is just making the past a self-fulfilling prophecy, together with all of the discriminatory signal that the past holds. So this is not to say that we cannot use technology productively to help keep ourselves in check in terms of whether we in fact are able to attain the objectives that we set for ourselves. Like if our goal is to increase workforce diversity, we can use measurement, right? We can use an algorithm to actually tell us, before this was your diversity metric, and now I'm tracking all this data and I can see that my new diversity metric is different, or it's the same, or it's worse. So really a productive conversation around the use of technology comes down to how well we are able to define the objectives that we want to meet, and then find ways to use technology to help us meet those objectives.
Thank you, Julia. I mean, I think that leads into the next question quite perfectly. So what intentional steps can Tandon take to increase the pipeline of individuals, female and underrepresented minority students entering the field of AI to begin to address these issues?
Jen, your turn, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, that was for Julia.
Oh, okay. I just took two questions in a row. Great question.
Well, it thematically they kind of flow together.
Yeah. So I think that we are already doing quite a lot, right? Having events like this one, I think goes a very long way to show that we have lots of folks such as ourselves, right? I mean, we all are women on this panel. And we also have quite a bit of diversity in terms of ethnicity as well. So I think that running events like this one, showing to students, showing to others that there is a community, that we are playing a very important role in this conversation, I think is a very important step. Just saying to people that we care, making sure that there are opportunities for students to engage in research and in education that centers around these topics that they care about, I think is extremely important. So, I want us to also pat ourselves on the back a little bit at Tandon. I think we're doing quite a lot, and I'm thrilled to see so much progress.
Thank you, Julia. Jen, I think you could speak to that more broadly, NYU and beyond. How can we ask that same question? What are we doing? What can we do personally in our lives and, in the workplace?
Yeah, I really love what Julia said about naming the objectives of all of this and then building the systems and processes to follow through on those objectives. And at the end of the day, if we're clear about the objectives of AI or any other piece of work that we're doing across NYU, it should be in service of making a better world for everyone. Starting with what Julia said at the beginning, AI can take work off your plate. Please do. But whatever the various ways are in which our work is furthering people's lives or livelihood, let's be clear about that and then have the systems follow through and have it clear the role that each of us can play. So I heard various choice points, and I'm new to AI. I should share that very clearly. So Julia, correct me, please. This is paraphrasing. I heard various choice points around accountability, around the design and iteration of the algorithms themselves, around the data we choose to feed the algorithm, and so on and so forth. And so having people with diverse perspectives who can bring a critical lens from a different angle to each of those questions and choice points only makes us all the more likely to design the systems, tools, processes that will achieve the objective we stated. And so I think by making it clear the strategic role that women, underrepresented minorities, and so on and so forth play in those choice points that bring us closer to achieving our objective, that strategic role is quite compelling to everyone, both the underrepresented individuals and their allies.
Thank you, Jen. So both of you are in leadership positions. And so someone would like to know, how do you prepare to manage those high stakes, strong emotions, and varied opinions in your respective environments?
I'll start, Julia. The ability to center myself, to pause and center myself, is one that I am continually working on. So the fact of the matter is, you will get triggered. You will have your, emotions get strong, et cetera, et cetera. However, what I do about it is a muscle that I can build. And so there are things that I can do on a daily basis: get enough sleep, exercise, connect with the people I love, eat healthy, etc., that are going to make me more effective at recentering in those moments of trigger, just because my body will be better at handling fears. I'll be more resourced to do so. And there are also things that I'm trying to work on in the moment, to help, even when, quite frankly, sleep evades me, I'm not exercising as much as I want, and so on and so forth. And for those things in the moment, it really is come from a place of curiosity. Truly try to understand what is the issue at hand from the other person's perspective and my own. Really try to grow that shared pool of meaning. Question myself as to whether I'm approaching this from a defensive, protective stance, or whether I'm actually approaching it from a curious, generative, creative stance. And then, of course, there are the pause techniques that I shared earlier. The quick way to remember that is self-awareness, pause, reframe. If I can be aware in the moment of the trigger, then I can create an intentional pause, which allows me to recenter myself. And if I am recentered, then I can reframe the way I'm viewing the situation and come at it, instead of a place from reactivity, a place of maximum choice.
I love that. Julia?
That's a great answer, and I don't have anything, nearly as insightful to add here. And you have to remember, I'm a computer scientist, right? We're engineers. So we don't really think, I'm joking, right? We don't think about emotions as much, and I'm better than most. But yeah, so the way that I don't think I have a leadership style, but one of the things that I knew always, even growing up, and I'm an only child surrounded by a bunch of adults, is that if you have a kind of a structure of subordination, that does not help with creativity. So I always insist that everybody calls me by my first name. I don't like to be called Professor Stoyanovich, in part because it's a very long last name, but also because I don't want there to be that asymmetry between me and the student, because that very often would prevent the student from being creative. So as much as possible, I like to be seen, and I don't know whether that in fact is happening, but maybe it's an illusion under which I live, but I like to be seen as a peer rather than as a kind of a supervisor. And, by the way, that very often backfires. I have a 7-year-old son, and I'm not able to discipline him either. He thinks he's my equal, but that's just essentially how, how we function.
Right, absolutely. So there is one last question here, and this is for Jen. And you actually touched on this earlier, but I'm sure more people would like to hear again. So we should listen more while other people are speaking to come to a common solution. But what if the other person doesn't want to listen and they keep on sharing their own thoughts?
Yes, this definitely happens. So at that point, you really have one of two options. You can either share what you are observing. I notice in the last 3 times that I spoke, you cut me off 2 out of the 3 times. Or I noticed in the last 2 times where you shared something, you repeated this same phrase. I think I'm understanding it. I understand it to mean, then enter whatever you understand it to mean. Is that capturing it? They'll respond if it is or if it's not. And then from there, you can say, okay, I'm really happy I understand what you're saying there. I think there's more. Can I have a chance to share, right? So basically, you can try to use the dialogue techniques to help that person center on the facts of you have been heard, you have been understood, but I haven't yet. If that works, great. And you're slowly growing that shared pool of meaning. There are going to be times where it does not work. And if that's the case, you need to create the pause to step away for both people. You can invite that person to reflect and come back if you think it's safe enough to do so. If you don't think it's safe enough to do so, then you need to step back and think about what you're going to do with the situation at hand. Sometimes all that's in our locus of control is to choose not to engage with that person again. Sometimes it's a work colleague and we have to engage with that person again. And we need to decide if there's a common set of standards in the workplace that we can refer back to that enable us to keep working with this person despite this block that's happening. Sometimes it's a question of whether someone on the team needs to leave the team and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, we can either continue to use our dialogue skills to make the person aware of the present facts and grow the understanding from there, or we have to step away and consider some alternate routes.
Thank you, Jen. I'd like to invite Rose to turn her camera back on as she gives us closing remarks. Thank you so much, Jen and Julia. I'd like to invite you to share any final thoughts you may have before we turn it over.
I just want to express gratitude. The questions were so rich. The engagement was so clear. Julia, you are phenomenal. Wow, I'm so excited about the center. Yeah. And I just want us to step into our power in honor of MLK Week, in honor of all that's been shared here. We have agency. We can create the world we want to live in. And let's do it.
What Jen said. Thank you, Jen. I learned a lot. And thank you for having us.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. That was such a great discussion. Thank you for sticking with us. Julia, Jen, phenomenal job. Thank you so much for being with us today. I also want to take a moment to thank the Student Affairs staff for their help and support with this event, but especially Ms. Alethea Orby, who, in addition to participating this evening, as you just saw, was the brains behind putting all of this together in a very short amount of time. So thank you very much, Alethea.
My pleasure.
You know what's going to happen now, right? You're just going to get more work. Also, I want to remind you that this is just the beginning of MLK Week. There are several more events going on in the coming days, including the university-wide event this Thursday night. You can click on the link in the chat and see all the events details and how to register if you haven't already done so. Thank you for being with us this evening. Have a wonderful night and stay warm.